everyone. My name is Jesse Chason with Lisa Blanchard as the host of Airing Addiction.
I share often my journey started on this campus. Got sober as a client here, just like you.
I really do see phenomenal change.
Always hope. I've seen situations that on the surface look impossible become possible.
Doing this podcast is to share those recovery stories, be honest about what the challenges are and have some real conversations, but kind of share that out on the airwaves.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Airing Addiction. My name's Jesse. I'm one of the co-hosts here. So glad that you could join us today. I can think of no other way than to start the week of Monday morning, right, with a live podcast. Thank you for listening wherever you are, and thank you for listening if you listen to us later. If you've been around for a little while and get the notifications when we go live, awesome. If you would like those notifications, wherever you listen to podcasts, just like or subscribe, and then we will notify you next time we are live. I will turn it over to our co-host Lisa to introduce our wonderful guest today.
Thanks, Jesse. So actually, this is a great day for me for a lot of reasons, right? So we're recording this in June. It is Pride Month. It is also the 2-year-ish anniversary of co-hosting this podcast. So I'm really excited to actually have my very first guest. If you remember that, Beck, you were my very first guest on the podcast 2 years ago. And so we decided it would be great to have you back, right? To talk a little bit more about your experience. And so I want to welcome Beck Gee-Cohen to the podcast. If you haven't listened to, my first, his last episode, I strongly suggest you do. We'll talk a little bit about his background and experience and story today, but I really encourage folks to listen to the last episode as well. It was really probably to this day still one of my absolute favorites to do, and I learned a lot. So happy to have you back. So maybe I'll just let you introduce yourself, Beck, and tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, and kind of how you got into this space.
Sure. Thank you both for having me. Wow, 2 years. I think that's like gone by so fast. Where's the time gone? Well, hi, everyone listening. My name is Beck Gee-Cohen. I use he, him pronouns. I work in the field of addiction and mental health at Visions Adolescent Teen. I work with teenagers. My sober date is 7/11/2005. So, 17 years is coming up, and I can't believe that. It's a whole wild story of recovery and just of life. And I got into this work because I'm sober, because I'm part of the LGBT community. I'm a proud trans man, and I just really wanted to give back. For me, it was, working in this field has been, and I share this a lot, is like a living amends. For the, in a lot of ways. I was a bartender, in a gay bar. And so Pride looks a lot different to me these days than it does, way back when. Doesn't mean that I still don't have fun, and I still don't dance, and I still don't, embrace my community. It just looks a lot different the way I give back during this month, the way I share about, the history of Pride Month, and really, my life is so much better today because of recovery. I don't think I'd be alive today without it. And I'm just, thank you for the reminder. Usually during this month is like, it's my birthday month. And then my sober, month is coming up. So I have a lot of self-reflection about, where I am, where I've been, how I got here, and also filled with a lot of gratitude. So thank you so much for having me. I can't believe, I don't even remember that I was your first guest. That's so funny. You have to go back and listen, everyone. We were probably there's probably lots of bumps, Lisa's probably so much, better, and just
I don't know about that. And I'm not sure we can honestly top it. Like it was such a great way. And it really taught me that I made the right decision by saying, you know what, I'll take on this podcast. Like we've got a lot of really great things to say. And we had that episode and I said, all right, sometimes the universe just tells you made a right decision. And I do really believe that first episode, like I walked away from it saying, I'm never going to stop doing this. Like this is cool.
So awesome. Yeah. So fun.
Awesome. So I think that's, a couple of things that you said that I think I'd love to talk a little bit more about, right? Like, a lot of, there's a lot more kind of media attention and focus on Pride Month. And, I think one of the things that you said is that, Pride Month used to look very different to you, maybe pre-recovery and what it looks like now. And can you just talk a little bit about kind of what does it look like for you now, and what are ways that we can encourage those in the LGBTQ community to celebrate in a recovery space, right?
Yeah,
because celebrations can be triggering.
Absolutely. I don't think I went to my first Pride festival, parade and everything until I was about 2 years sober. I wasn't necessarily ready for that. I went with a bunch of sober people and had an amazing time, but I definitely had to have my things in order, right? My recovery space in order to go, because I was really nervous, right? That was a place where, those celebration and excitement and fun happened. There was a lot of using and a lot of, drinking that happened. And, I think the first year I was sober, it was really frustrating. It felt really lonely. So anyone out there who's probably LGBTQ early in recovery and isn't participating in your usual Pride festivities, I totally get it. And I totally empathize with it. I probably kicked up, meetings and hanging out with sober people quite a bit more, even through that time, because I felt out of place because I was so used to it. And, today, I was just thinking, because I'm here in Los Angeles and Pride, we had 2 Pride weekends. We had West Hollywood Pride and Los Angeles Pride. I don't know. they kicked up the activities here. I didn't go to either of them this year because I work, with teens. And for me, my Pride is creating a space in treatment for them that celebrates Pride, so we brought a bunch of decorations. We're having a big Pride party at the end of the month. We do, in groups, we talk about history of Pride. We watch shows that have LGBTQ characters, things like that. And that's for all, we're not LGBT specific. That's all the kids. Everyone watches and participates in that because I think it's really important. I think young people don't know the history of Pride and where it came from and how it started. I think it's really, really important for young people to understand why we do what we do. Specifically today, with just a lot of different kind of things, legislation coming our way, especially for trans youth and drag shows that you can't go to anymore, or things like that are still disrupting our community. There's still a wall and a hurdle to get over. There are other things to do out there besides just go and drink and use and party. Not to say that Pride parades and things like that aren't amazing and everything like that, but I think that there's more to it. And it's more for me too, right? Like I said, when I was using, that was it, right? That was it. The party was where I, began and ended, and that was it. And today it looks just a little bit different. I really kind of reflect about, how this all got started, how far we've come and how far we need to go.
Yeah, Beck, you bring up a lot of good points. I especially like when you said that, it used to be just all about partying and you didn't really, not that you didn't say you didn't care about the history of it, but I know for me as someone in recovery, any excuse to use or drink and just get out of myself for a little while, whether it be a giant celebration or, a Monday morning.
Right.
It was, I got to do something because I don't feel comfortable in my own skin. And as I'm like, ferociously taking down notes here because I'm learning a lot. I did listen to the first episode as well, which had a lot to unpack in it. But I'm wondering, especially for Pride Month, as much as you feel like sharing about, the history of Pride and maybe just an overview for the people who are listening and, know it's Pride Month, maybe see things on the news, maybe even been to an event, but like don't really know what it's all about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's interesting, because Pride really started at a bar, right? And it started as a riot. It started as queer and trans people tired of being policed in their bodies and for their sexuality and for the way they presented themselves. Stonewall Inn is a famous bar in New York City, and actually, it's funny because that's where we say it started. But even prior to that, here in California, the Black Cat, there's the cafeteria up in San Francisco. There were these kind of starting to have these like kind of disruptions of people saying, no, you can't police us anymore. You can't take us to jail because we're wearing women's clothes or because, we're with men or, any of these things. So there was these small pockets of disruption and pushback and fighting back that were happening even prior to Stonewall. And so, but Stonewall is really kind of where, on June 28th, which is actually my belly button birthday. So I always believe that I was like born to do this work, right? Like I was born.
It's not a coincidence, Beck.
That June 28th, 1969, where the people who were in the bar were fought back, where they talk about like the first brick was thrown, and then I think there was just this like Judy Garland had passed away. There was like a lot of like feelings and emotions and all of this stuff, and so we started in the street, right? We started in the street, and that's what we do, right? And we started our first, riot, pride, parade. It wasn't a parade then, right? It was really saying like, you can't do this to us anymore. We deserve human rights. We deserve to be seen. We deserve to be, respected. And in that it has just grown, right? And it's grown into the parties and, Christina Aguilera performing, right? She performed this weekend in LA, right? And so we have these like, it grew to that, but like, can't forget why it started, right? We can't forget that, because there was such disparity, especially for trans women and trans women of color, right? Who really this civil rights movement is on the backs of. And we still have so much further to go, because I think a lot of people, when I do my work and I go out and speak and do these things, people are like, well, you have marriage equality now. And it's like, well, that's great. But in, 32 states, I can still be fired for being trans, and 29 for being gay. There's still massive disparity for especially trans people in healthcare, housing, employment. And so again, like, it's amazing. And I don't, take for granted what we have now and what we fought for. And we still have so much further to go. There's 160 legislations against trans youth in the states that are running, that are coming up. Trans kids have lost the right to go, play sports in Texas and Florida and Missouri. I can't even keep up sometimes, right? So we've gained rights, we're starting to lose rights again. So we have to keep, we have to keep up. and I'm a big believer in my own recovery, is that recovery is a social justice action, right? And because addiction is a social justice issue, I think that drugs and alcohol in our community has really kept us at bay and kept us from being able to fight, right? Because 30 to 40% of LGBT people have substance use issues compared to 9% of the general population. So the work that I do now is a lot more around the advocacy around, mental health and substance use and recovery, right? And because we need to recover, we need to, we need to be aware so that we can fight. Makes sense.
I appreciate so much of what you just said, because what really strikes me, right, coming from, multiple years in addiction work, is that, as a field, as providers, as those in the recovery community, right, we're used to having to advocate and fight. Right. We're used to having to advocate for treatment options and pay, and equity in healthcare and, legislation that stops incarceration. Like, we're used to that kind of advocacy. And so I think we're perfectly positioned as a recovery community to support at the same time the rights of the LGBTQ community, right? Whether that's those in recovery or just in general, right? Because it really does impact all of us. And a couple of the other things that you said too, and I appreciate you giving kind of the brief history. We just recently, as we've talked about before, Beck, we have a gender responsiveness committee at Spectrum and New England Recovery Center, and we've been doing kind of newsletters just to kind of keep the conversation going. You did train all of our staff, like hundreds of our staff, and we really appreciate that. We'll be talking about more trainings, but sometimes it's about keeping that kind of highlight and conversation going, so that, of course, we did a newsletter for Pride Month, and we made sure to include kind of, this is the history, right? This is not just kind of, it was more of a march than a parade, right? And more of a kind of taking to the streets because it was necessary, versus just a celebration. And so, including that history, I really appreciate it. And it is all connected, right? And individuals in the LGBTQ community and in the recovery community have kind of that intersection of stigma kind of coming from all levels. And that really can impact the, long-term recovery and health and well-being.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I love that you said, right, it's a parallel. There's a lot of parallels between, even like coming out, or I like to talk about the coming out process for queer and trans people can sometimes really look like the coming out process of coming out sober. So like, if those of you who are listening today who are not part of the LGBT community, who may be in recovery, you've done this, right? We've all had to come out in some way, and we've all had to feel, shame and stigma around, and maybe losing friends, right? I always talk about, I've had a couple of coming out processes, and one of the biggest ones was coming out sober. I lost a lot of friends, right, when I came out sober, and I, there are probably better people to lose, right? But there's a lot of questioning, like, well, why would you do that? Don't you feel like, you're not that way? You're not one of those people, right? Those kinds of questions came up when I got sober. Same thing when I came out as gay and when I came out as trans, right? Like those, it's such a parallel process. The feeling of, we hear it a lot in recovery spaces, like, I don't feel comfortable in my skin, right? That's a conversation that a lot of trans people also have. Like, I don't feel comfortable in my skin. I just want to live my truth and find my authentic self and who am I? And that's a very, like, again, like a parallel conversation that people in the recovery community are having. So if you don't know someone who's LGBTQ, which is pretty rare these days, right? But if you're in recovery, like, you can have some understanding and empathy for what the queer and trans community are going through. And the queer and trans community can also have empathy for what, how people who are getting sober, sober in their community may be going through. And I like to say that because there's, we do have a robust community, LGBT community, who is sober and in recovery. And it can also feel a little stigmatizing from, just from different spaces if you're not in recovery, right? Or I basically grew up in a bar, right? Like and I say that because I started bartending when I was 21 years old and until I was 27, until I got sober. And that was my family. they were my family because my family wasn't, super there for me around being queer, right? So I went to the bar and they became my family. And then when I got sober, they were like, you're not one of us anymore. So I had to find another family in recovery. And so we also talk in recovery spaces about family of choice, right? Like our recovery family sometimes is our family of choice, and LGBT community has family of choice as well. So there's a lot of parallels between people in recovery, the LGBT community, the stigmatizing of both spaces, and also the recovery, the beauty, the celebration, because I don't want to dismiss that either, because I don't want to dismiss, like, it's not all like sad and gloomy, right? Like we wouldn't stay in recovery if it sucked all the time, right? So I think that we also, the celebration piece is really important too.
Yeah, and I think you brought up a great point right at the beginning when we kicked off this, Beck, where you said, I even though you were uncomfortable in your own skin and you're searching for family of choice, and you get sober and you have that coming out process, and then you stay away from Pride, I think you said, for 2 years, right? And that was just so striking to me, because you're going through the intersection of recovery and gender, and here's this sort of safe place, if you will, but you had the wherewithal to say, it's probably not a good idea for me to go there, at least right now. Right. And I think that's important for those listening and watching. It's not saying that we can never go there. Right. I'm sure you've been to many celebrations and probably started a few yourself. Right. But it's I think you said something about getting your recovery space in order first. Right. And as I'm sitting here and just listening to you and Lisa, there's just so many correlations between recovery and LGBTQ. And I'm reminded too, you talk about your, and sorry for talking over you earlier. I was just so amazed. You can't make this stuff up, right? Your belly button birthday, June 28th, also, when the first brick was thrown, we just passed June 10th, which was also a anniversary of sorts. That's where 12-step recovery considers its, founding in 1935. And I'm reminded of many, many stories in 12-step recovery where, they don't, not that they don't care, but they don't hold it against anyone: race, color, creed, nationality, religion. The only requirement for membership is a desire to stop drinking or desire to stop using. And there's been, to Lisa's point, historically over the years, many situations where an identifiable fact of someone's life comes up, and the recovery community says, no, you're still one of us, right? We still embrace you, right? So I could go on and talk with you, but I know we have a time limit here. I'd love to hear what's new since the last 2 years, since you came on the podcast. What new sort of work you've been doing in this space?
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about the last 2 years. They've been a blur, and just when you think we're out of COVID, someone close to you gets COVID, so I'm grateful that I've continued to work, and it's continued to stay busy. I think one of the things is that addiction doesn't go away. I do think that in the recovery spaces, like, one thing that we do know, and again, another parallel of like the LGBT community, is like, we know how to deal with a pandemic, right? I mean, addiction in and of itself is a pandemic, right? HIV and AIDS, right, was one of the biggest pandemics that took most of the, gay and trans community out of this world, unfortunately. And so it's like something that it's like, okay, we've done this before, or we're and so even though we have Zoom fatigue and all of that stuff, right, we knew where to go. And I'm so grateful for that, because that's like where I went. I started a trans men's meeting, and it started with 4 of us, and now it's up to like 30 across the world, sometimes 40. And it's just like and we're going to keep it going, because again, like I think with, we've been able to kind of have these like smaller spaces, like really kind of smaller community spaces. And I say small because it's like I couldn't like walk into a meeting and see 40 trans guys, there's like no way I could do that, but online I can. And so that has been, something that has been very near and dear to my heart. And also, like, I think, I've been, what have I been doing? I've been, blessed enough to have bought a house over the last year. Things, I mean, these are like the miracles of recovery for sure for me, that I never thought would happen. So I do a lot of gardening, more than I didn't even think I would like gardening. And so it's something that has been very peaceful for me, and doing, it's like, it's those things that I look back again, like, just like self-reflection is like 17 years ago, there's no way I would think that where my life is today, like I'm like kind of a boring old man, but I love it and I'm happy. And I get to work with teenagers who keep me on my toes, and I get to, I call it gay Christmas, right? Because like during the holidays, we like kind of get set up for the kids, and we, especially kids in treatment and people in treatment, it sucks during the holiday. It could suck, right? Sometimes it's better to not be home during the holidays, right? But we set up, like we make it a big event. So it's like around 6 months in between, right? So we get to like, I've just been buying a lot of stuff. There's lots of rainbows in my room. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if I've been doing a whole lot, but I feel like I feel fulfilled. I feel good. It's been hard, just like with everyone, right? It's been hard to kind of manage like what life looks like today. I hate the saying new normal, because this is not normal. This is, working with young people who have been stuck at home for 2 years, who have not been to school, who have not been to, in real life connection. It has affected people in a really significant way. And my hope is that we can come out of this, and that we can kind of get back to like, just connecting with others. I think that having these screens, we've so disconnected from others that we don't actually see the humanity in people. I think that's why there's so many, like, it's a lot of, fighting, a lot of disruption right now. I think people just don't know how to be around others, and that I see that in when a young person comes to treatment and I've been isolated in their room for 2 years. It's getting them back to like connection, and that goes for me too, right? I get a little nervous and scared when I'm in person. I'm like, what? How do I do this? And I'm an extrovert, I love being around people. Been to a couple conferences, and I'm like, oh, like, how do I manage this, right? And but ultimately, it's nice to be getting back.
And it's amazing how comfortable we've gotten with this, right? Like that we can keep the things that we have learned that are helpful, right? So I think your meeting that you started is a perfect example of that, right? It doesn't mean that's the only meeting you'll take part in, right? Like, because we do still need that connection, but the ability to have, a specific group, right, of trans men in recovery, like we wouldn't necessarily have kind of thought of that until out of necessity, we all had to communicate via Zoom. Right. And then I was like, well, what else can we do? And I think that we get to keep those things. Like as clinicians, we get to keep telehealth access, right? So that somebody who can't make it to treatment can still show up. Or, if there's no transportation for that teenager to get to session, they can still see someone and kind of still have some of that connection. And I think specifically about the LGBTQ youth, right, that must have been particularly challenging. And that all the work that we can do, again, with this parallel process of supporting building connections for youth is actually, in this recovery space, a substance use prevention activity, right? Like if we can really support youth in general, but support especially the LGBTQ youth, then hopefully we're preventing significant addiction, right? Because we know that, addiction thrives in isolation and recovery thrives in connection. And we have to kind of get back to that space.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and it's interesting because we do have some kids who actually did pretty better because they were getting bullied at school, right? So going home, but that doesn't mean that they didn't get harmed from not making any other connections, right? That isolation is not actually healthy. Yes, not going to school was great, but not connecting with others in a in-person way definitely had a significant impact. And the kids who had at home weren't really supported and who had to stay home for 2 years, that really impacted them. So my hope is that we can come out of that and we can start to, we're starting to see them going back to school or starting to see them, reconnecting. And it's going to take a while. We actually won't know what the impact is for years to come.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And you bring up a bunch of great points here, Beck, especially, I consider myself an introverted extrovert, right? Like I want to be around people, and I know, what Lisa just said to be true on a personal level about, addiction thrives in isolation, right? And the connections, I think of, when I'm at a mutual aid meeting or even just, talking to somebody at a random event about, find out you're in recovery. It's like a whole nother understanding. It's like, oh, you get me on a level that maybe somebody else doesn't. Right. And how hard it's been to find that same connection, not impossible, but how hard it's been over Zoom. Right. So I was so pleased. I figured you would have created some type of recovery group. So I was so pleased that you did that. And when you said, it's all over the world, that's one of the benefits that I've found too, going to meetings in different states, in different countries, seeing that, maybe the surface looks different of addiction, but underlying, I say all the time, there's many more similarities than differences between us.
For sure. I wanted to touch on something just quickly. You talked about Founders Day. I have this great picture of Bill W. that says, just get in the car, right? And I think, when LGBT people feel like they don't have a place in AA or anything like that is really understanding. There's actually a book out that's called The History of Gay People in Alcoholics Anonymous, and that the third tradition, which states the only requirement for membership is a desire to stop drinking, actually came because a gay man came to Bill W. and at the time in 1935 was like, I'm a sexual deviant, which is, where, there's that stigma, right? But that, he was gay, and, Bill W. had to go back and say, like, when they were creating these traditions. And so I always say that we have a place there, right? Like we created that tradition. Like that is the only requirement to go to a meeting as a desire, right? It doesn't, again, like you said, like, race, class, gender, any of that. I've been in meetings where I showed up and it was like, an all women's meeting. And I'm like, oh no, but there's no other meeting. And they say, well, third tradition, right? States, right? And I can stay because sobriety is the number one thing, recovery is number one thing, and, Marty Mann, who's like the first woman of Alcoholics Anonymous, basically was a lesbian, right? Like, I mean, we have a history. We were part of this movement. We were part of this recovery movement, and we will continue to be.
Yeah. And to your point too, I love the history of AA, and I don't want to get too far down this rabbit hole, but there was another gay male who actually wrote the book Living Sober and was Lois Wilson's companion after Bill passed on, and really, was her everything after Bill died, right? Going to conventions together and, from the practical, taking care of to the emotional support. And I like to think out of that experience, that book was created, which was just such a really, blessing in my life when I read it.
Yeah, such a wonderful book to like have, in early recovery. So those of you who are in early recovery, make sure you get that. I would always I would just be like sitting there and just like, oh, what am I doing? And I just like flip open, I'd be like, okay, like here's a question, right? And it was a gift, specifically in early recovery. So thank you for sharing that as well. I think, again, I think once we know that we have a part of and we are a part of, it's easier to settle in a little bit because it can feel so like I don't belong here, right? And I got sober. I mean, I shared this in the first podcast, I believe, but I got sober in Bozeman, Montana with a bunch of cowboys. And, at the time I'm like tattooed, I have like two-tone hair, and they just love me, right? They just love this little queer young person who is not wearing a 10-gallon hat and a big old buckle, but because I needed to get sober, because they loved me for that. And I think for me, I helped that change their minds about some things as well.
That's so amazing. And so what I'd love to talk about kind of some of the rest of our time is kind of what next, right? Like we talked a little bit before we started that I feel like we as a community kind of take a few steps forward and then several steps back. And there's real risk, for many communities, but particularly the LGBTQ community, right? For losing rights that we have gained, or for, just not making the progress, across the country specifically, right? There's big differences across states on what can be done and what can't be. And so I guess, back to that parallel of, all those of us that are listening to an Airing Addiction podcast, right? We're either part of the recovery community or we are supporting the recovery community. And so, we know how to do this. What can we do? Like, what are the next steps? What are the things that we should focus on? Is it education, legislation? Like, what are the things that, we should come together as a community and do?
Yeah, for sure. I think the first thing, I think it can feel overwhelming. I know as someone who's part of and who gets kind of involved in this work, it just feels so overwhelming to be like, what can I do? Right. And so it's what I've learned in recovery is the next right action, right? What is the next right action? And first of all, is what can I do at arm's length, right? Be kind to the people that are near me, nearest to me. When I see homophobia, transphobia, racism, things like that, I say something, right? Especially if I'm in a place of power, if I'm a white cisgender heterosexual male, or if I'm in a place where because the safety is a concern, for unfortunately these days for sharing, and a lot of people don't step in because their fear of safety, but it really just takes hey, we don't say that, right? Or if we have friends who are saying those things, or family members, right? It starts in that space, in the smaller spaces, having those really hard conversations and saying learning, educating yourself, going on, we have a plethora of information, but going on different spaces, learning trans stories, learning stories about the history of the LGBT community. You can go on any platform right now because it's Pride Month and there's tons of, documentaries, things like that. Just getting yourself informed, having a conversation. I'm always willing to have a conversation with people. If you've never met a trans person before, right? If you've never had a conversation, find out what are the facts and what are the myths. I think what happens is the myths get so blasted on, in certain spaces that there's it's fear mongering in a lot of ways. And so when you actually talk to someone, just when you talk to someone in recovery, right? You actually get to know that we are human, right? That we have feelings, that we have, dreams and hopes and all of these things. So once, I think it's so much easier to demonize someone that you just don't know, right? Or and you don't have to understand what being trans is, but you should respect it, right? Like people's autonomy, people's, ability to make their own choices, to have their own lives and to have their own opinions and things, and be respectful and loving and kind and more than tolerance, right? It's just affirming someone in their path. And so that's where I would start. Obviously I always say getting political, right? We have to, as like people in recovery spaces too, have to get political around because these legislations affect all of us. It's not just, queer and trans people. They could affect your kid someday. They could affect, like your, they just affect humans in general. Like that should be enough, but like they could affect someone that you love, that you don't actually even know about, right? And, when we step into those legislations, we also step into those spaces of recovery too, right? Like, legislations that are, happening for, getting proper health care, getting insurance to cover mental health and substance use treatment, things like that. Like we have to like be part of, and it can, like I said, it can all feel overwhelming. So if we can just, reach out to the next person, to the people that are in front of us, hopefully that will also, kind of span out over and across to other people.
Yeah. And it ties back to what we talked about with what the impacts of the pandemic, right? Like if we can just get back to some of that humanity, right? And seeing each other's humanity, that can have a huge ripple effect, right? Just like we tell recovery stories here on the podcast, right? It's not, folks are not like a number on an overdose list, right? It's not just treatment numbers. Like these are actual people with real stories, right? That we should be listening to and raising up the voices of those with lived experience.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And like you said, Beck, you said so much, but I jotted down somewhere here, the difference between finding out the facts versus the myths, right? And there's so many correlations with, those in recovery. When I share my story, it just happened yesterday. I mentioned where, what's the most common thing for males to do when they meet each other for the first time? What do you do? And it comes up and, for me, that's a leading question because I always, give a little bit more than just what I do. And, when you said, I think the first thing you said here, what should we focus on? Just doing the next right action, right? And I was brought back kind of to tie everything together here as we're wrapping up. Founders Day, Akron, Ohio, Dr. Bob's grave. There's a little plaque right next to it. And the 4 absolutes were what they went off of when they tried to figure out the next right thing, right? And it's absolute honesty, unselfishness, love, and purity. Pretty basic stuff, right? Like Lisa, you said, humanity. Treat other people like a human, right? Is it absolutely honest, absolutely unselfish, absolutely loving, and absolutely pure? If it is, it's the next right action. That's what I should be doing on a daily basis, regardless of recovery status, gender, race, creed, sports team, whatever.
Yeah. And we can, I think in that point, we can have our differences, right? We can have, that's what the world is like, right? Like we have our differences. We can have different sports teams. We can fight all day long that the Dodgers are better than.
Oof. I knew.
No, I don't know. but we can debate that all day, but we should not be debating people's lives.
Yeah.
Right. And so, we should be celebrating. We should be celebrating our differences. We should be celebrating that, that people are getting sober. We should be celebrating that, like all of those things and debating the little stuff, right? Debating the fun stuff and not people's rights. So, but just thank you for this conversation this morning. It woke me up. This is great.
Literally.
Yeah. Well, Thanks again for coming back. I will not rule out asking you to come back and talk with us again. I do, like I said in the very beginning, like I plan to, do this podcast for a long time, right? Because as soon as I did it, as soon as we had that first podcast together back, I knew that was the right thing, right? That was something that we should be doing. And so thanks so much for coming back. We'll be talking more about having you continue to train our staff. That's had ripple effects that I don't even think we could comprehend as an organization. And I just appreciate you. So
thank you so much. It was really awesome to be able to be in that space with you all.
Thanks, Beck. Pleasure talking to you.
All right,
Take care.
Everybody, subscribe, stay with us and have a great rest of your June and Pride Month.
See you next time.
Thanks.